So you completely erase their biological origins.
Hmm.
I mean, you adopt a son in 7th century tribal Arabia, and the very first thing that happens is he just takes your name.
Right. He takes your tribal lineage entirely.
Exactly. He's no longer the son of his father, you know. He is absorbed completely into your social hierarchy, into your power structure.
And then right into the middle of this incredibly entrenched ancient system drops Surah Al-Ahzab, Surah 33, Ayat 5 of the Quran.
Yeah. And the directive there is astonishingly blunt. It literally commands, call them by their biological father's names.
Which is, I mean, it's the pulling of the ultimate linchpin.
It really is. And on the surface, you might hear that and think, okay, well, it's an administrative update, right? Like a little record-keeping adjustment.
Let's make sure the census is accurate.
Right. But to understand the true gravity of this for our deep dive today, we need to step back. Because this is actually the complete dissolution of human social hierarchy.
It absolutely is. And that's exactly what we're unpacking through the research of Allama Parwez.
Yeah, Parwez was a 20th century scholar, and he approached the Quran not as a book of mystical rituals or theological poetry, but as a rigid socioeconomic constitution.
Which is a huge paradigm shift in how you read the text.
Totally. So we're going to look at how a handful of sentences fundamentally dismantled an entire societal architecture based on blood, and then replaced it with one based on systemic participation.
Mm.
But to grasp Parwez's analysis, you really have to understand what it actually meant to erase a name in that specific time and place.
Yeah, you have to put yourself right in that environment. We are talking about the Hijaz, which is a harsh desert society with absolutely no central state apparatus.
None at all.
Right. If you look at the surrounding empires of the time, like the Byzantines or the Sassanids, they had standing armies, taxation systems, courts, massive bureaucracies.
They had infrastructure.
Exactly. 7th century Arabia had none of that.
Yeah.
There is no government registry, there are no birth certificates, no passports, and certainly no police force to call if you get robbed.
So it's just total anarchy.
Well, not anarchy, but a completely privatized, hyper-localized system of survival. In that world, your ibn, your son of designation, was basically your entire existence.
Like your social security number, essentially.
It was your social security, your legal standing,
Right.
your economic access, your credit score, and your physical protection, all just rolled into a single word.
Okay, let's bring this down to earth for a second. Let's say I am a merchant traveling through the desert with a caravan of goods, and I get ambushed by a rival group.
Right.
I have no police to call. So if I survive, what is my recourse?
Your only recourse is your bloodline. The attackers know that if they kill you or steal your goods, your tribe, so your extended biological network, is bound by the law of blood retaliation to hunt them down.
So the tribe is the ultimate insurance policy.
Exactly. If you don't have an ibn connecting you to a powerful tribe, you are literally invisible to the law. You're open prey.
Wow.
No one will avenge you, which means anyone can kill you without consequence.
So when these wealthy, powerful, tribal elites were adopting people, whether it was war captives or poorer individuals or just people they wanted to control, they weren't like running a charity.
Not at all.
They were essentially running hostile takeovers of human capital.
That is the perfect way to look at it. They were artificially inflating their tribe's numbers, their prestige, and their military strength.
It's a mechanism for the elite to hoard people.
Yeah. A powerful chieftain could absorb 30 men, erase their biological father's names, and legally brand them with his own name. And suddenly, he has 30 new loyal soldiers.
30 new economic producers.
Right, and all of their labor and loyalty flows upward directly to him.
It's corporate consolidation, but with human beings.
And it solidifies this incredibly rigid caste system where the bloodline is everything. So when Parwez looks at Ayat 5, call them by their actual father's names, he argues this isn't about biological accuracy.
Or some sentimental attachment to birth parents.
No, it is a direct assault on the economic and political monopolies of the tribal chiefs.
It strips them of their ability to manufacture fake bloodlines to consolidate power.
It shatters the entire illusion. The system is stepping in and declaring that lineage can no longer be used as the organizing principle of social rights.
Or duties, or power hoarding.
Exactly. By forcing the adopted son to retain his biological name, the Quranic system severs the legal and economic absorption of that individual into the chieftain's private empire.
Wait, hold on though. I get the theory here. You dismantle the fake tribal lineages,
Right.
and you stop the chieftains from hoarding human capital.
Right.
But this creates a massive, glaring vacuum. Let's be real. if you take away my fabricated connection to a powerful chieftain, and you force me to use the name of my biological father who might be, I don't know, a nobody or dead or completely powerless, aren't you just stripping away my only source of protection?
That is the big question.
Right. What happens to the most vulnerable people in this society? The orphan, the foundling, the war captive, whose parentage is completely entirely unknown. If blood and lineage are the only things keeping you alive, and the new system says no more fake bloodlines, and you don't even know your own blood, where do you fit? You're essentially throwing them to the wolves.
It seems that way, but that is exactly where the structural genius of the system reveals itself. The text anticipates this exact vacuum.
Okay, how?
Well, if you cannot be called by your father's name because it's genuinely unknown, the Quran provides a clear, categorical answer for those individuals.
Which is?
They are to be absorbed into the community as ikwanukum fayadin, your brothers in the system or brothers in religion, and mawalikum, your friends or allies.
Okay, I have to stop you there because brothers in religion sounds, it sounds like a bumper sticker.
A platitude.
Yeah, it sounds like a very soft spiritual sentiment, something a wealthy chief says to an orphan on a holiday to feel good about himself. Like, you have no food, you have no tribe, but hey, you're my brother in spirit.
Right.
That doesn't keep a foundling from starving in a famine.
And that interpretation, that soft, sentimental one, is exactly what Parwez pushes back against. Traditionally, it is read as a warm, fuzzy platitude. But Parwez analyzes this socioeconomically.
Okay, so what's his take?
He argues that ikwanukum fayadin is not a sentimental pat on the back. It is a hard, structural, legal category.
Explain how a legal category actually feeds an orphan, though.
So in the old system, if you were a foundling erased from the lineage map, you were a non-entity. You were relegated to the absolute bottom of the socioeconomic ladder.
Like a slave or an outcast.
Exactly. But under this new Quranic framework, if your parentage is unknown, you are legally and economically absorbed into the community purely by your participation in the ideological system.
Not by a single drop of blood.
Not a single drop.
So it's essentially citizenship.
Yes. Economic and legal citizenship based entirely on ideological adherence. The term mawalikum implies a legal ally, someone with explicit rights, responsibilities, and a guaranteed share in the economic distribution of the society.
Think about how entirely radical this recategorization of human worth was for the 7th century tribal mind.
It's a complete paradigm shift.
You're taking a nameless, fatherless, foundling someone who yesterday was considered basically biological garbage by the tribal elites, and you're saying they stand on the exact same legal and economic footing as the chief of the Quraysh.
Simply because they both subscribe to the same socioeconomic constitution.
It means human value is no longer inherited, it's enacted. Your rights are not based on who your father was, they're based on your participation in the system.
And if you follow the laws of the system, you are entitled to the protections and economic provisions of the system. Parwez notes that this completely democratizes human worth.
I see the logic, but the enforcement of that seems, well, impossible. Human nature doesn't just pivot because a text says so.
True.
You have these tribal elites who are used to absolute authority, used to viewing people as property, and now they're being told, hey, this nameless orphan is your legal and economic equal.
They aren't going to just give up their power and wealth voluntarily.
Exactly. If I don't belong to the tribe of Hashim or the tribe of Umayyah anymore, but I belong to this new ideological brotherhood who is anchoring this, who actually guarantees my rights, who forces the wealthy elite to treat the foundling as a brother in the system.
Which brings us directly to the structural authority of this new society, outlined in the very next verse, verse 6.
Yep.
It states, "The prophet is closer to the believers than they are to themselves."
Now, historically, I've almost exclusively heard this read in a very mystical, supernatural way.
Right, like a metaphysical claim.
Yeah, about the prophet's soul being intertwined with the souls of the believers, a claim of supreme spiritual elevation.
And Parwez discards that mystical reading entirely. He reads this with incredible, almost surgical precision. He argues that this is not a metaphysical claim at all.
So what is it?
It's a purely systemic constitutional claim. It has to be, because we are talking about the establishment of a state, a functioning society that has just abolished its previous power structure.
Let's unpack that idea of the prophet being closer to the believers than their own selves. How does a socioeconomic lens actually interpret that phrasing?
We need a real-world analogy to make this abstract concept concrete for you. Think about the role of a constitution in a modern functioning republic.
Okay.
A constitution doesn't have magical powers, it doesn't have a soul, but it is closer to the citizens than their own private desires, in the sense that it overrides their personal ego-driven preferences for the sake of equity.
Oh, I see. Let me see if I can map this out. My own ego, myself,
Right.
wants to hoard wealth. Myself wants to favor my cousins for a job.
Exactly.
Myself wants violent revenge when someone insults me. But if I live in a constitutional republic, the law steps in and says, no, you must pay taxes. You cannot engage in nepotism. You cannot commit vigilante violence.
Yes. The objective rule of law supersedes your arbitrary, selfish instincts. Now, project that back to 7th century Medina.
Okay.
The prophet, in this context, is the one who carries, embodies, and transmits the law of this new system. He is essentially the living constitution.
Therefore, his systemic authority naturally has priority over any individual's private interests.
So when the verse says he is closer to them than their own selves, it's saying the sister he represents overrides their personal ego.
The closeness described in the Quran is the closeness of a governing, equitable framework to every single life it governs.
It is the ultimate leveling mechanism. When Parwez analyzes this, he emphasizes that this demands that systemic law supersedes personal opinion.
So if the law of the new system dictates that surplus wealth must circulate to the orphans and the foundlings, the wealthy elite can't just say, but I want to keep it because I earned it and myself desires it.
Right. The system's directive is closer to you, more binding upon you than your own personal desire.
It replaces the rule of the tribal chieftain, who ruled by whim, bias, and blood preference, with an equitable framework.
Which completely strips away the arbitrary power of human rulers over other humans. It substitutes it with the sovereignty of a principle-based legal code administered in this foundational period by the prophet.
Okay, this is fascinating, but it introduces a massive vulnerability.
How so?
If the prophet's authority is constitutional, if he is the walking, breathing embodiment of this new system that is overriding everyone's ego and wealth hoarding, that makes him the ultimate political center of gravity.
He's the single point of failure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And by extension, it completely redefines his household. Because anyone who wants to corrupt this new system, anyone who wants to take back their wealth and power, just needs to get close to that center of gravity.
You are hitting on the exact political tension of the era. You really have to look at the immediate political reality in Medina at that time.
Right, it was a volatile situation.
Very. You had a nascent, highly disruptive system being built.
Yeah.
It was surrounded by hostile empires on the outside, but more dangerously, it was infested with internal political opportunists.
The historical sources in the Quran itself point out that there were hypocrites, right?
Yes, people pretending to be part of the new system, but actively working to undermine it from within.
Fifth columnists.
Precisely. These were individuals deeply invested in the old capitalist and tribal ways. They saw their monopolies broken, their slaves freed, their wealth redistributed.
So they were just playing along for survival.
Waiting for a moment of weakness to hijack the system and revert it to the old ways. Now, project forward. The prophet is a mortal man. He is going to pass away.
Right.
When the living constitution dies, what happens to his household? What happens to his wives?
Well, if his wives were considered just regular widows, it would be an absolute political free-for-all. Every ambitious, power-hungry hypocrite, every former tribal chieftain would immediately try to marry one of his widows.
Why? Walk through the political calculation of an opportunist in that scenario.
Because it's the oldest trick in the political playbook. You marry into the royal family to get the throne. We see this throughout history.
The Ptolemies, the Tudors.
Exactly. If I'm an opportunist who secretly hates this new equitable system and I marry the prophet's widow, I instantly absorb his lingering authority. I can claim false legitimacy.
You could say, look, I am now the heir to his authority because I am the patriarch of his household.
And then I can use that proximity to start twisting the laws back in my favor.
Or, even more insidiously, you could use that intimate access to spread rumors and scandals.
Oh, wow.
You marry the widow, and then you start saying, well, in private, the prophet actually told my wife that the elites should keep their wealth.
Or he actually told my wife that my specific tribe is superior.
You use the marriage to destabilize the entire ideological foundation of the system from the inside out.
Which brings us to the second half of verse 6. And his wives are their mothers.
And much like the first half of the verse, the traditional reading elevates these women to a station of mystical reverence. A beautiful spiritual compliment, right? They are the spiritual mothers of all believers.
But Parwez applies that same sociopolitical, juridical lens here. He says, no, this motherhood establishes a strict legal and social category.
It is an ironclad constitutional safeguard.
Think about the legal mechanism it triggers. By declaring his wives the mothers of the believers, the Quran establishes a non-negotiable legal block, the incest taboo.
A son cannot marry his mother.
It instantly, permanently takes these women off the political chessboard.
It is a brilliantly designed institutional defense mechanism. The incest taboo is one of the most deeply ingrained, universal human baselines.
Yeah, it crosses almost all cultural lines.
By legally categorizing the Prophet's wives as mothers to the entire community, the text ensures that absolutely no one, no matter how powerful, how ambitious, or how cunning, can ever marry them after the Prophet's passing.
It totally neutralizes the threat of hijacking. You literally cannot marry your way into constitutional authority.
It means their status carries specific legal duties and protections within the new social order. They are provided for by the state, they are respected, their well-being is guaranteed.
But they can never be leveraged as political stepping stones by opportunists.
Exactly. It strips away the mystical aura often attached to this verse and reveals it as a piece of pragmatic constitutional law.
It protects the integrity of the state.
It ensures that leadership and authority in this new society cannot be inherited through marriage or bloodlines connected to the Prophet's household.
The authority remains tied entirely to the principles of the system, not to a genealogical or marital link to the founder.
It completely prevents the recreation of a dynasty.
It's incredible how cohesive this all is when you pull it out of the realm of theology and read it structurally. Let's synthesize all these threads because we've covered a lot of ground today.
It's a lot to take in.
When you take Ayat 5 and Ayat 6 together as a single continuous blueprint, you aren't looking at a random collection of rules about adoption and who you can't marry. What you are looking at is a complete renegotiation of the terms of human belonging.
It is a systematic teardown of the old world and the construction of a new one. In these two verses, bloodline gives way to systemic participation.
The unknown foundling, who used to be disposable garbage in the tribal system, is absorbed by ideological brotherhood and guaranteed economic and legal rights.
And the power structures are fundamentally redefined. The Prophet's authority is established as a governing constitutional framework rather than a supernatural, unchecked autocracy.
His household carries institutional protective status to prevent opportunistic hijacking.
What Parwez identifies here is that every single move the text makes is directional. It is moving away from genealogy and moving toward equitable principles.
This shift from blood to belief, from inherited hierarchy to systemic equality, is the Quran's defining contribution to social thought.
It makes the bold argument that a society cannot be truly just and cannot function equitably as long as a person's worth and access to resources are determined by the arbitrary lottery of their birth.
Which leaves you with a pretty massive, uncomfortable question to ask yourself when you look at the world today. We like to think we are light years ahead of 7th century tribal Arabia. We sit here with our modern democracies, our complex constitutions, our globalized markets.
And we think we've moved past the Ibn system.
But look closely at our global society, our economics, our politics. How much of it still operates entirely on inherited privilege, on nepotism, on who your father is?
From legacy admissions at elite universities that guard the gates of power, to the hoarding of generational wealth that dictates who gets to fail and try again.
To political dynasties that stretch across decades in supposed democracies, we are still, in so many fundamental ways, obsessed with bloodlines and exclusionary networks. So imagine what it would actually look like today to build a community where your access to rights, respect, and economic protection relies 100% on your commitment to the system's equitable principles and 0% on your bloodline.